All right, listener, buckle up because today we're doing something a little different. We're going to try a little thought experiment. We're going to fast forward to 2025 and imagine you are a newly elected conservative president. You walk into the Oval Office ready to make some big changes. But where do you even begin? Well, luckily for you, there's a 600-page document called Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise.
It's basically a playbook packed with advice from dozens of experts on how to, in their view, put America back on the right track. Obviously, we can't go through all 600 pages today, but we are going to break down some of the most fascinating and sometimes controversial parts of this document. To help us make sense of it all, we've got an expert in the studio today, a veteran policy analyst who's seen it all, someone who can tell us not just what the document says, but what it might actually mean for America if a president decided to follow it.
It's certainly a fascinating document, and the historical context is important, too. You know, the first Mandate for Leadership came out during the Reagan era, and it actually had a huge impact on policy. Wow, so this isn't just some theoretical document. This is a plan that's been put into action before. I mean, it worked for Reagan, right?
Well, worked is a loaded term, but it definitely had a significant impact on the direction of the country. And now it seems conservatives are looking to revive those ideas for the 21st century.
Okay, so let's say you're that conservative president in 2025, fresh off of victory. You open up this Mandate for Leadership. What jumps out at you? What are the big priorities?
Well, one of the biggest concerns they raise is the power of what they call the administrative state.
The administrative state. Okay, that sounds a little ominous. What exactly does that mean?
Basically, it's the idea that unelected bureaucrats have too much power, that they can often thwart the will of elected officials and the people.
Interesting. So they see career government employees, the people who actually run the day-to-day operations of the government, as a potential obstacle to their agenda.
Exactly. They argue that these bureaucrats are often resistant to change, especially change coming from a conservative president.
Okay, I see the challenge. So what's the solution? How do they propose to deal with this administrative state?
Well, the document recommends a pretty bold approach. They call it handcuffing the bureaucracy.
Handcuffing? That sounds pretty serious. What would that look like in practice?
Think executive orders, strategic appointments, even budget cuts. The idea is to use all the tools at the president's disposal to rein in agencies, limit their power, and make sure they're aligned with the president's agenda.
So it's not just about changing policies. It's about fundamentally changing the way the government operates. It's about who holds the power, who gets to make the decisions.
Precisely. They even point to some examples like Executive Order 13777, which President Trump signed to enforce regulatory reform. That's the kind of assertive action they're advocating for.
That's fascinating. So taming the bureaucracy is a top priority, but what about the big picture? What are the overarching goals of this Mandate for Leadership? What kind of America are they envisioning?
In a nutshell, it's about restoring American strength, both domestically and on the world stage. They see America as having strayed from its core principles, and they believe it's time to get back to what they consider conservative values.
Okay, so a return to conservative values, but what does that mean in concrete terms? What are those values?
Things like individual liberty, limited government, free markets, a strong national defense. It's about reducing the size and scope of government, empowering individuals and families, and projecting American power abroad.
Got it. So a pretty traditional conservative agenda, but they also talk a lot about threats to this vision, right?
Yeah.
Where do they see the biggest challenges coming from?
They're very clear about that. China is the #1 challenge. They see China's growing economic and military power, coupled with its, let's say, assertive foreign policy, as a direct threat to American interests and to the global order.
That's a pretty stark assessment. So how do they propose to counter this threat from China? What are their recommendations?
They advocate for a two-pronged approach. First, rebuilding the American military to maintain what they call a decisive advantage. And second, making China's aggression unaffordable.
Unaffordable. That's some strong language. What would that look like?
Think a combination of economic sanctions, bolstering military alliances in the Asia-Pacific region, and generally taking a much tougher stance against China on a range of issues.
Okay, so they've got the bureaucracy in China in their sights. But what about on the home front? What are some of the key domestic issues they focus on?
Well, one major theme is strengthening families and communities. They argue that strong families are the foundation of a healthy society, and the government policy should reflect that.
That's a pretty common refrain from conservatives, but I'm curious to hear how they translate that into specific policies.
Some of their recommendations are pretty standard, like promoting fatherhood and encouraging two-parent households. But others are a bit more surprising, like using the tax code to encourage marriage and family formation.
So essentially rewarding people for getting married and having children.
Right.
Interesting. It sounds like they're trying to use the power of government to incentivize certain behaviors.
Exactly. They also advocate for reforming welfare programs to promote work and reduce dependence on government assistance.
So it's all about encouraging self-sufficiency and personal responsibility, classic conservative themes.
Exactly. They believe that the best way to help people is to empower them to help themselves, not to create a culture of dependency.
Okay, so we've got a glimpse into their social agenda. But what about the bread and butter issues, like the economy? How do they propose to revitalize the American economy?
It's all about free markets and getting government out of the way. Think tax cuts, deregulation, and empowering entrepreneurs.
So a classic supply-side approach. But how does that translate to concrete action? What agencies do they target for reform?
They call for a more business-friendly approach to agencies like the Department of Commerce and the Department of Labor. For example, they want to use the Department of Commerce to promote trade deals that benefit American workers and reduce regulations that they see as burdensome on businesses.
So it's all about creating a more favorable environment for American companies to thrive.
Exactly. They believe that when businesses succeed, everyone succeeds. It's about creating jobs, growing the economy, and lifting people out of poverty.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about tackling the bureaucracy, countering China, strengthening families, and revitalizing the economy. It's an ambitious agenda, to say the least. But before we dive into the specifics of how they propose to implement all of this, let's take a step back and consider the big picture. This document presents a very specific vision of how to use government power, a vision rooted in conservative principles.
Absolutely. And it's a vision that's sure to generate both support and opposition.
Exactly. So as we move forward and delve deeper into this mandate for leadership, I want you, our listener, to think critically about what you're hearing. Does this vision align with your own values? What would you prioritize if you were sitting in the Oval Office? We'll be back in a moment to explore those questions and more. All right, listener, welcome back to our deep dive into Mandate for Leadership. We've laid out the broad strokes of their vision, but now it's time to roll up our sleeves and get into the nitty-gritty. Let's talk about how a conservative president following this document might actually approach specific government agencies. Where do they see the biggest opportunities for change?
One agency that really stands out is the Department of Homeland Security. They argue that DHS has become too bloated and bureaucratic, strained from its core mission of protecting the homeland.
Okay, so they want to shake things up at DHS. What do they recommend?
A major streamlining effort, cut programs they deem unnecessary, consolidate offices, and really give more power to the Secretary of Homeland Security.
Less red tape, more decisive action. But what about immigration? That's always a hot-button issue, and I'm sure this document doesn't shy away from it.
You're absolutely right. They advocate for a much tougher stance on immigration, stricter enforcement of existing laws, a crackdown on illegal immigration,
So what does that look like in practice?
increased border security, more border patrol agents, and making it harder for undocumented immigrants to live and work in the U.S.
That's a pretty hardline stance. It would certainly be popular with their base, but spark some serious debate across the country. Shifting gears a bit, what about foreign policy? We talked about China as a major threat, but how would they approach diplomacy and engagement with the rest of the world?
They call for a significant shift in the State Department. They argue that it's become too focused on globalism and multilateralism, neglecting American interests in the process.
So less international cooperation, more focus on America's own interests.
Exactly. They recommend shrinking the Foreign Service, streamlining embassies, and really emphasizing a more America-first approach to diplomacy.
Interesting. So a less internationally focused, more nationalist approach. Okay, let's shift gears again. What about areas like education and healthcare? Those are always top of mind for voters.
On education, they're big proponents of school choice. They want to give parents more options and more control over their children's education.
Which aligns with their emphasis on individual liberty and limited government intervention.
Exactly. They believe that parents, not bureaucrats, should be in charge of their children's education.
School choice is a complex issue with strong opinions on both sides. It would definitely be a major point of contention if a president tried to implement it. What about healthcare? How do they propose tackling the rising costs and complexity of the healthcare system?
They're quite critical of the Affordable Care Act. They argue that it's actually made things worse in many ways.
So are they calling for a full repeal?
Yes, they advocate for repealing and replacing it with a market-based system.
What would that look like?
A system that emphasizes patient choice and competition. They believe that the free market can provide better and more affordable health care than a government-run system.
So a more free market approach to healthcare. We're seeing a clear pattern here of reducing government intervention and empowering individuals and the private sector. But what about the agencies that regulate those sectors? How do they view the role of agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency or the Department of Energy?
They argue that agencies like the EPA and the Department of Energy have become too powerful and overreaching, stifling economic growth with burdensome regulations.
Huh.
They want to significantly reduce their regulatory power, giving more authority back to the states.
That would be a major shift in the balance of power between the federal government and the states. What specific changes do they envision for those agencies?
For the EPA, they advocate for a more streamlined and less intrusive approach to environmental protection.
So fewer regulations and more reliance on market-based solutions.
Exactly. They argue that current regulations are too costly and stifle innovation.
And what about the Department of Energy? What changes do they propose there?
They want to refocus the department on ensuring energy independence and promoting all forms of energy production, including fossil fuels.
That's a stance that's likely to face pushback from those concerned about climate change.
Absolutely. It's a point where their vision may clash with the priorities of other groups, particularly those advocating for a rapid transition to renewable energy sources.
So it's a clear example of how these recommendations, while potentially appealing to some, could generate significant controversy and debate. So, listener, as we're going through these recommendations, I want you to keep thinking critically. Where do you stand on these issues? What kind of balance would you strike as president?
It's important to remember that governing is all about navigating competing priorities and making tough choices. This document lays out one vision, but it's up to each individual to decide whether they agree with its recommendations.
That's a great point. Okay, we've talked about some of the bigger agencies, but what about the smaller ones? Are there any less obvious targets for reform in this mandate for leadership?
One that might surprise you is the Small Business Administration. Now, they do see value in the SBA, but they believe it can be more efficient and effective.
Okay, so not eliminate it entirely, but reform it. What do they suggest?
They recommend streamlining the loan process, reducing bureaucracy, and focusing more on providing technical assistance and counseling to entrepreneurs.
So it's not about eliminating the SBA altogether, but about making it work better for small businesses. What's the reasoning behind that?
They emphasize the importance of reducing regulations on small businesses in general. They argue that excessive regulations can stifle innovation and make it harder for small businesses to compete.
So level the playing field, give small businesses a fighting chance.
Exactly. They see small businesses as the engine of economic growth, and they want to unleash their potential by reducing the burden of government.
It sounds like they see small businesses as a vital part of the economy, and they want to unleash their potential by reducing the burden of government. That's a theme we've seen repeated throughout this document.
It's a consistent thread running through their recommendations, reducing government intervention and empowering individuals and the private sector to drive economic growth and prosperity.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, but I want to touch on one more crucial area before we wrap up this part of the deep dive national security. We talked about China, but how do they view the role of the intelligence community in keeping America safe?
They argue that the intelligence community has become too politicized and bogged down in bureaucracy, losing sight of its core mission of gathering intelligence on foreign threats.
So what do they propose?
A number of reforms, strengthening oversight, reducing bureaucracy, and really refocusing the agencies on their primary mission, protecting national security.
So making sure the intelligence agencies are serving the national interest and not getting caught up in political agendas.
Precisely. They also emphasize the importance of protecting sources and methods, and of using intelligence responsibly to inform policy decisions.
Okay, listener, we've explored a wide range of agencies and departments today, and it's clear that this mandate for leadership envisions a pretty significant restructuring of the federal government. As we move on to the final part of this step dive, we'll delve into some of the potentially more controversial aspects of their vision, like their stance on social issues and the role of government in addressing societal challenges. All right, listener, welcome back for the final stretch of our deep dive into mandate for leadership. We've walked through a lot of the recommendations, from reshaping government agencies to their vision for the economy, but now it's time to wade into some of the more shall we say, heated waters, the stuff that might really get people talking.
You're not wrong. This document doesn't shy away from taking a stand on some pretty contentious issues, and those stances could definitely ruffle some feathers.
Well, let's not beat around the bush. Let's jump right in. We've talked about China as a major focus of this document, but I want to dig a little deeper into that. They don't just see China as a competitor, right? They see it as a real adversary.
Yeah, they use some pretty strong language when it comes to China. They talk about China's growing influence as a threat to democracy and freedom around the world. And they argue that the U.S. needs to be prepared to push back, even if it means some tough choices.
Like, what what kind of tough choices are we talking about?
Well, they suggest things like imposing stricter trade policies, reassessing diplomatic relationships, even reconsidering foreign aid to countries that align too closely with China.
So putting America's interests first, even if it means potentially straining relationships with other countries.
Exactly. They argue that the U.S. can't afford to be naive or sentimental when dealing with a country like China, which they see as playing by a different set of rules.
That's a pretty hardline stance.
Yeah.
It would definitely have ripple effects across the globe.
Okay, let's move on to another potentially controversial area,
Hmm.
social policy. This document is clearly rooted in traditional conservative values, so I'm guessing some of their recommendations might clash with more progressive viewpoints. You're not wrong. They're very clear about their belief that strong families are the foundation of a healthy society. And they translate that belief into some pretty specific policy recommendations.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, they talk a lot about promoting marriage and reducing out-of-wedlock births. They suggest using the tax code to incentivize marriage and family formation. They also advocate for reforming welfare programs to encourage work and self-sufficiency.
So, a pretty traditional view of family structure and a strong emphasis on personal responsibility. It's a theme we've seen throughout this document.
Exactly. They believe that government should support families, but they're wary of creating what they see as a culture of dependency.
Interesting. So, how do these views play out in other areas of social policy, like education or LGBTQ plus rights?
Well, on education, as we mentioned earlier, they're big proponents of school choice. They believe parents should have more options and more control over their children's education.
Which aligns with their broader emphasis on individual liberty and limited government.
Exactly. They also talk a lot about protecting religious liberty, which could be interpreted in ways that impact LGBTQ plus rights.
That's an area where their stance could definitely spark some debate.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit and talk about their overall philosophy on the role of government. We've already seen their desire to shrink the bureaucracy and reduce regulations. But what about the government's role in addressing issues like poverty or inequality?
They generally favor a more limited role for government in those areas. They argue that excessive government intervention can actually do more harm than good, creating dependency and stifling individual initiative.
So they put more faith in the private sector and individual effort than in government programs.
Exactly. They believe that the best way to help people is to create an environment where they can succeed through hard work and opportunity, not through government handouts. That's a perspective that's been debated for generations. There's no easy answer to those questions. Okay, one final, potentially contentious topic I want to touch on is climate change. We've seen their support for traditional energy sources and their desire to roll back environmental regulations. But how do they actually address the issue of climate change itself?
Their position on climate change is, well, let's just say it's nuanced. They acknowledge that the climate is changing, but they question the extent to which human activity is to blame.
So they're not fully on board with the scientific consensus on climate change.
Right. They also argue that the economic costs of aggressive climate action outweigh the potential benefits.
So a more cautious approach, prioritizing economic considerations over environmental concerns.
Exactly. It's an approach that's sure to draw criticism from environmental activists and scientists who believe more urgent action is needed.
Okay, listener, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the mandate for leadership in detail, from its big picture vision to its specific policy recommendations. We've highlighted areas of potential controversy and encouraged you to think critically about the implications of this document.
It's been a fascinating conversation, and hopefully it's given you a better understanding of one perspective on how to govern America.
Exactly. Remember, this is just one blueprint, one vision among many. It's up to each individual to decide whether they agree with its recommendations and whether they believe it's the right path for the country. We hope this deep dive has given you the information and insights you need to form your own opinions, and we encourage you to continue exploring these issues, learning more, and engaging in thoughtful discussions. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a different fascinating topic. Until then, stay curious.